Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Story 1: The Miller's Complaint. A village feud in 13th century France. It begins with a complaint, a handwritten petition delivered to the local bailey in the summer of 1278. It is signed with a cross by a man named Bernard, a miller from a small hamlet near Tours. The document, written in Latin he cannot read, is the product of days of labor and a single evening of dictation to the village priest. The complaint is simple. A neighboring landholder has rerouted a stream, and Bernard's mill has fallen silent. But this was not just any mill, it was the lifeblood of the village. The justice of the medieval world often hinged on seemingly minor disputes. In the case of Bernard the miller, the struggle was not over murder or heresy, but about water, flour, and jurisdiction. For peasants like Bernard, whose income depended on a consistent water supply, even a subtle change to a stream could mean hunger. In a system where every person owed labor or dues to someone else, justice was deeply tied to infrastructure and influence. Bernard's enemy in this feud was not another peasant, but a petty knight named Anseau de Givray. The knight owned the land upstream and had constructed a small stone channel, effectively diverting a portion of the river to irrigate his own fields. While this improved his barley yields, it destroyed the power source for Bernard's wooden water wheel. In 13th century France, the right to mill was often bound by feudal contracts. Bernard was not merely a craftsman, he was a banal miller, operating under the seigneurial system. That meant his lord, the local seigneur, Geoffrey de Massigny, had the exclusive right to operate mills and force his tenants to use them. Bernard paid rent for the privilege of working the mill, taking a portion of each sack of grain as his due. The water that turned the wheel was not his in any modern legal sense. It was governed by customary rights, layered, vague, and fiercely defended. To claim justice, Bernard needed more than a complaint. He needed proof, but proof in the medieval world did not look like what you might expect. There were no photos, no water rights codified in state law. Instead, Bernard had to rely on witnesses and more specifically on oaths. In village justice, it was common to gather oath helpers, usually kin or respected neighbors, to swear to a claim. This system, called compurgation, was less about evidence and more about reputation. A man standing in the village could decide the outcome of his case. In Bernard's case, he enlisted 6 men, 2 cousins, the baker who bought his flour, and 3 elderly farmers who remembered the river's course in their youth. He also took a risk by involving the church. While the priest was willing to write the complaint, he warned Bernard. By escalating the matter, he might trigger a wider conflict, one that could bring him before a traveling royal judge, or worse, embroil him in a tangle of feudal allegiances. Because here lay the deeper issue. The seigneur of Bernard's village, Geoffrey, was technically subordinate to Anseau de Givray's family. While Geoffrey had recently tried to claim more autonomy, levying his own tolls and taxes, he was still, on parchment at least, a vassal. If Bernard's case suggested Geoffrey couldn't protect his tenants, it might provoke a dangerous reassertion of authority from Anseau's liege. Justice in medieval France was a delicate web of power and performance. A man like Bernard had to consider not only the law, but who benefited from enforcing it. To complicate matters, the region had recently seen a spate of unrest due to tax changes, particularly the gabelle, a salt tax imposed by the crown. Royal agents had been passing through the countryside more frequently. Some feared this would lead to more centralized control. Others hoped it would mean fairer trials and oversight. So when Bernard's petition reached the local court, a curia held every month in the manor hall, he waited nervously among the assembled villagers. The steward of the court, speaking for Seigneur Geoffrey, read the complaint aloud and summoned Anseau's man-at-arms, who denied all wrongdoing. No written orders for the diversion existed. The stream, he claimed, had always run as it now did. The steward decided to delay. Too many variables, too much risk. The matter, he ruled, might require judgment at a higher level. Bernard was told to travel to Chinon, where a bailey appointed by the king would hold sessions in the autumn. As he prepared for the journey 2 days on foot, through thick forest paths, Bernard wondered, what would justice look like in a place he had never seen, ruled by men who didn't know his name? Would they see a wronged miller, or a meddler in affairs best left to lords? Bernard set out before sunrise. His wife handed him a small bundle of rye bread, a strip of smoked pork, and a tightly wound cloth pouch containing 4 deniers, the last of their coin. A walking stick, worn smooth from years of leaning against the wall near the hearth, became his only companion on the forest road. The road to Chinon, while modest by royal standards, was one of the more traveled routes in Touraine. But road was a generous term. It was little more than a widening path where trees had been cleared, hemmed in by brush and shadow. Bandits, wolves, and rumors walked those woods. Bernard, however, was more worried about arriving late than getting robbed. To miss the bailey's session would mean forfeiting his chance at justice. Chinon was no small hamlet like his own. It was a royal town, home to a fortress often visited by King Philip III's officials. With its tall limestone walls, noisy markets, and multilingual murmurs of Gascon, Breton, and Latin, it might as well have been another world. The bailey, a royal representative of the Capetian crown, held sway here, and unlike the local seigneurs, his judgments could not be overturned without the king's leave. For a man like Bernard, this was both hope and terror. The idea behind these royal agents was relatively new. For generations, justice had been primarily local, administered by lords, bishops, and stewards. But as the French monarchy expanded its authority, particularly under Philip Augustus and his heirs, the crown sought to impose a new model of order, uniform, written, and at least in theory above the petty disputes of nobility. The bailies were the instruments of that new order. They were trained, often literate, and usually not of noble birth. Some were former clerks, others younger sons of knights. What they shared was allegiance to the king, not the landed powers of the region. For peasants and merchants, this could be a blessing. For lords and local elites, it was often a challenge or a provocation. When Bernard arrived in Chinon, the gates were open but guarded. He passed beneath the worn stone arch, eyes wide at the sight of mounted guards in gleaming mail. The courthouse was a former merchant hall, converted to hold regular sessions of justice. Inside, the air smelled of candle wax, ink, and the dust of thousands of shoes. There were already over a dozen petitioners ahead of him. The court moved slowly. Each case began with a statement read by a scribe. Some claimants had full parchments prepared, others dictated orally and relied on scribes to record their words. Bernard noticed the difference immediately. Those who had paid for scribes in advance, some dressed in finer wool, one even wearing soft leather shoes, were received more swiftly. Their Latin was clearer, their cases crisper. Bernard, for his part, waited 5 hours before being called. He stood before a long table, behind which sat the bailey, flanked by 2 clerks. A large crucifix loomed behind them. The scribe read Bernard's petition, then gestured for him to speak. "My lord," Bernard said, "I am a miller. My wheel is stopped. The water that once gave grain to the people now feeds only one man's barley. I seek a judgment." The bailey asked pointed questions. Was the diversion new? How long had Bernard operated the mill? Had there been any written license, by charter or by oral grant, to control the stream? Had he brought witnesses? Bernard produced 3 written statements declarations, again dictated to the priest signed with marks by his neighbors. These were not notarized, but they were accepted provisionally. The bailey raised his brows at the inclusion of 2 older men, both of whom had sworn they remembered the river before the Knight's Dam was built. "I will send a clerk to investigate," the bailey said at last. "He will examine the channel and the course of the stream. If your account holds true, the Knight may be summoned." This was more than Bernard had hoped. A royal clerk was a rarity in the countryside. His presence alone would unsettle the fragile network of local power. As Bernard returned to his village, he spread the news carefully, first to his wife, then to the priest, then over 2 days to the others who had supported him. When the royal clerk arrived 3 weeks later, the effect was immediate. He was not alone. 2 guards accompanied him, both carrying the seal of the bailey. The clerk, named Renaud, was a thin man in his 30s with a serious manner and a clear disdain for being lodged in peasant homes. Still, he did his work with methodical precision. He examined the mill first. The wheel Bernard showed him had sat idle since the spring. The basin was dry. Moss had overtaken the stones. Then Renaud followed the stream's course for a mile upstream, taking notes in a small leather-bound book. He stopped at the channel Anso had built, a stone aqueduct, no more than a few feet wide, but enough to pull water into a separate trough leading to his fields. Renaud made no comment, but sketched the structure in his notebook. The villagers who trailed behind him whispered among themselves. The mere sight of a royal agent inspecting the Knight's works was unprecedented. Anso de Givray, when finally summoned, did not attend the court in person. He sent a reeve, who offered a thin defense, that the stream had always meandered in this fashion, that no one could prove otherwise, and that Anso's rights to modify his land were ancestral and unquestionable. But Renaud's report was clear. The channel had been newly constructed. Stone showed no signs of long-term weathering. The water level below the junction dropped precipitously. Now the decision fell back to the bailey. And here lay the true test. Would the royal system dare issue a ruling against a noble knight, even one of minor standing? For Bernard, it was a long 2 weeks of waiting. He returned to Chinon in the fall, the leaves already turning copper along the Loire. In the courtroom, he stood again before the same table, the same clerks. The bailey read aloud from Renaud's report. Then he delivered judgment. "The stream shall be returned to its former course. The channel shall be closed. The Knight, Anso de Givray, is hereby ordered to comply under penalty of fine and forfeiture. The miller, Bernard, is granted right to operate the banal mill as previously." A gasp ran through the room. It was a modest victory, perhaps, but it was also a symbol. The royal court had ruled in favor of a peasant against a knight. In Chinon, such things were beginning to happen more frequently. It was a shift, subtle but real, from private justice to public order, from feudal dominance to centralized law. And yet, as Bernard prepared to return home, his victory uncertainly won. He could not help but wonder, would Anso obey? And what exactly would a knight do when defied by parchment? The judgment from Chinon traveled faster than Bernard's weary steps could carry him. Word had spread not only in his own hamlet, but in neighboring villages as well. A peasant miller had won a ruling against a knight through royal justice. For some this was cause for celebration, for others concern. Anso de Givray was not known for restraint. Though not a high lord, he commanded deference through land and steel. His retinue was modest, perhaps a dozen men-at-arms, 2 squires and a clerk, but it was more than enough to intimidate peasants and enforce feudal demands. And so it was no surprise that when Bernard returned to the banks of the stream, he found the aqueduct still intact. The channel gurgled with water, his mill untouched and still silent. Anso had not complied. It was one thing to receive justice on parchment, and another to see it realized in the fields. The distance between Chinon's law and the muddy boots of a knight was measured not only in miles but in custom and pride. The Bailey's court had no standing army. Enforcement, in practice, relied on the willingness of local lords to obey. In cases where they did not, it became a game of delay, avoidance, and pressure. Bernard had won a ruling but not yet justice. Over the next few weeks, Bernard again reached out to the priest, to the scribes in Chinon, to the other millers along the Loire who faced similar diversions. One of them, a man named Hugues, had spent a decade entangled in legal battles with his own seigneur over tithes. His advice was grim. A knight yields only when he fears something more than shame. But things were changing. By winter, the royal clerk Renaud returned. This time, not to inspect but to enforce. He carried a writ bearing the Bailey's seal, and more importantly, he was accompanied by 4 mounted guards, professional soldiers in royal livery. It was an unmistakable sign. The court intended to make good on its judgment. Renaud's approach was strategic. He did not confront Anseau directly. Instead, he went to Seigneur Geoffroy, Bernard's own lord, and warned him that failure to obey the ruling could lead to broader scrutiny, tax records reviewed, privileges revoked. Geoffroy, cautious and politically astute, agreed to intercede. It took another 2 weeks, a formal mediation and the quiet threat of forfeiture before Anseau relented. Not publicly, not with apology, but one morning in early February, a group of his men came with hammers and crowbars, and under the passive gaze of Renaud's soldiers, they dismantled the stone channel. Water, muddy but insistent, flowed back into the original stream bed. It took Bernard a full day to clear the mill's basin of silt, another to check the gear and wheel. On the 3rd day, the mill turned again. Grain returned. Flour rose in cloth sacks. The familiar, rhythmic clatter of wood and stone echoed once more across the valley. For Bernard, it was not just the sound of livelihood. It was the sound of recognition, that his labor, though humble, could be defended, that justice, though slow, could be summoned. But not without cost. In the months that followed, Anseau's presence loomed. He did not retaliate directly, but Bernard's standing in the region remained uncertain. Whispers followed him, the miller who went to the king's men. For some, he was brave, for others, reckless. The feudal world had not vanished, it had simply shifted its posture. Still, something had changed. The royal court's decision had a ripple effect. A tanner in the next village filed a complaint against his own steward for excessive tolls. A widow sought restitution for land improperly seized after her husband's death. None of these cases would have reached a court a generation earlier. The idea of royal justice, imperfect, uneven, but present, had taken root. Historians now understand this period, the late 13th century, as a turning point in the judicial structures of France. The crown expanded its influence not through conquest, but through courts, through paper and ink, seals and scribes. It was a slow revolution, made not by nobles and generals, but by millers, widows, and wandering clerks. Bernard's story does not end in glory. He never rose in status. He continued to mill grain until his death some years later, outlived by the mill he repaired with his own hands. His name appears only once more in the records, attached to a minor tax dispute resolved in a local court. But his victory marked something larger. The moment when justice in the medieval world began to be something more than a tool of the powerful. It became a process tedious, fragile, and sometimes boring, but also a lifeline. The mill still stands today, though no longer in use. The stream runs as it once did, quietly passing beneath moss-covered stones. And one wonders, had Bernard not made that journey to Chinon, not gathered those oaths, not endured the uncertainty of distant judgment, how long would the silence have lasted? How many other voices were never heard? Story 2, Blood and Balance. Trial by combat in the age of chivalry. It is difficult in the modern mind to imagine the solemnity with which two armored men might meet in a field not for war but for judgment. Yet for several centuries in medieval Europe, trial by combat was a legally sanctioned method of resolving disputes, particularly among the nobility. This was not dueling for honor in the romantic sense, nor mere bloodlust. This was justice. In the year 1215, in the Duchy of Lorraine, a land riddled with patchworks of feudal loyalties, a dispute arose between two men of rank, Sir Matthew de Broglie and Sir Henry de Gérardcourt. The matter concerned a claim of treason, a grave accusation that, if proven, would see one man hanged and his lands forfeit. But proof in the medieval world did not always rest on documents or testimonies. In cases of treason, where the accusation was difficult to substantiate and no neutral witnesses could be found, the court invoked the divine. God would judge the truth. Thus was the Judicium Dei, the judgment of God, trial by combat. Henry had accused Matthew of conspiring with enemies of the duchy specifically, of providing information to a rival claimant to a border stronghold near Metz. No letter had been intercepted, but a servant had overheard whispers in the dark. It was enough for the count to permit the case. As neither man was willing to yield, and neither could conclusively prove the other false, it fell to the field. The location chosen was a traditional combat ground near Toul, already known for its rectangular earthwork arena and wooden spectator stands. These duels were rare, but when they occurred, they attracted crowds. Nobles, townsfolk, and monks gathered to watch divine judgment unfold not in sermons or scriptures, but through mail and mace. The preparations were extensive. Both knights were required to present themselves 3 days before the fight, to swear oaths before the ecclesiastical and secular judges. They declared their innocence, or, in Henry's case, his accusation upon relics finger bones of saints, believed to ensure truthfulness. Each man was assigned a second to oversee the fairness of the proceedings. The weapons chosen, longswords reinforced with iron guards. Shields were permitted but not horses. This would be fought on foot, in full chainmail beneath the watching sky. These combats followed a strict protocol. The court specified a start time mid-morning, after mass priests would bless the field and pray that God reveal the truth. It was believed that he would grant strength to the righteous and weakness to the liar. Yet these were not wild, unstructured brawls. There were rules. A man who yielded could be spared, though his honor would be destroyed and the case lost. A man who lost consciousness or was disarmed might be deemed guilty, depending on the discretion of the presiding judge. Death was not required, but it was common. For the nobility, trial by combat served as a bridge between the traditions of honor and the growing need for legal formality. In a world where family name and land were all, the idea of defending one's cause through physical prowess made sense. It was not merely about who was stronger, it was about who was right, in the eyes of heaven. On the day of the combat, July 17, 1215, the field was packed. A canvas awning had been erected for the local bishop and members of the ducal court. The sun was high, the air tense. The two knights entered from opposite ends of the field, each flanked by squires bearing water, weapons, and spare helms. Sir Matthew wore a tunic of deep blue over his hauberk, marked with a silver cross. His family's crest had once adorned a small keep outside Nancy, now mostly ruined. Sir Henry wore crimson and gold, colors associated with his liege. Their helms, once donned, turned them into faceless icons of a system that could not function without symbols. When the signal was given a horn blast and a nod from the bishop, the combat began. The opening strikes were cautious, testing. The swords rang off mail, glancing and deflecting. The audience was silent, reverent, as if in church. For 10 minutes the men circled and struck, their heavy armor weighing down every motion. Dust rose from the earth as feet scuffed and stamped. Then Henry slipped. Not enough to fall, but enough for Matthew to strike hard against his shoulder, forcing him backward. Cheers rose briefly, then fell as Henry recovered and swung low, catching Matthew's leg and sending him to one knee. The balance shifted again. This is how these combats went, not elegant but grinding, a test of strength, endurance, and nerves. What was God's role in this truly? That question lingered in the minds of many, especially clergy. In fact, it was in this very year, 1215, that the Fourth Lateran Council convened in Rome. Among many decrees, it discouraged clergy from participating in or blessing judicial duels. A slow shift had begun, one that would eventually see trial by combat fade into legend. But in Lorraine, on that day it still held force. After nearly 25 minutes, both men were battered. Blood had begun to seep through Matthew's mail at the thigh, while Henry's shield was splintered. Their swings slowed. Their breathing was ragged. Then a final exchange. Henry lunged with a downward cut which Matthew deflected. In the same motion, Matthew thrust forward his blade, catching beneath Henry's armpit where the mail was thinner. Henry collapsed. His second rushed forward, but the judge raised a hand. The duel was over. Sir Matthew stood, swaying slightly, waiting for the declaration. The bishop stepped forward not to bless but to observe. The ducal steward pronounced the result. The accused had proven his case. God had judged him innocent. Sir Henry, gravely wounded but alive, was carried away. His accusation was deemed false. His lands were to be seized, his name tainted. And yet, was God truly the arbiter here? Or had victory simply gone to the better fighter, the stronger man? These questions haunted not only the observers, but the legal scholars of the day. Canon lawyers began to argue that truth could not reliably be found in combat. Reason, they said, must triumph over brute strength. Still, for a time, the sword remained a witness. In the aftermath, Sir Matthew returned to his estate, his honor intact, but his thigh wound never fully healed. He walked with a limp for the rest of his days, a reminder, perhaps, that justice, even when claimed, exacted its price. The field near Towle hosted its last formal duel just 2 decades later. After that, legal reforms, ecclesiastical pressure, and changing cultural norms relegated trial by combat to a memory. But during that brief window, centuries long in some regions, it was the field, not the bench, where right and wrong were decided. And in such a system, one might ask, what became of those too poor or too weak to take up the sword in their defense? The image of 2 armored knights fighting in a solemn judicial contest captures much of the imagination surrounding medieval justice. But trial by combat was never limited solely to nobles. In fact, throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, legal duels appeared in cities, villages, and even monastic communities, places where swords were rare and shields rarer still. Among the peasantry and in urban centers, combat was often cruder, yet still a legitimate and deeply feared mechanism of law. In many parts of the Holy Roman Empire and northern France, trial by battle was codified into customary law. While the nobility could rely on ceremonial duels with heralds and referees, common folk faced simpler but arguably more brutal standards. One such case occurred in the town of Nördlingen in Swabia in the year 1294. A cooper named Hans was accused of theft, specifically of breaking into a merchant's home and stealing 2 bolts of fine woolen cloth. Hans, a quiet man in his 40s with no previous criminal record, denied the charge. He claimed that he had been home that night, ill from spoiled fish. His wife confirmed it, but the merchant had a servant who swore under oath that he saw Hans near the alley where the theft occurred. Lacking decisive evidence, the town council invoked a legally permitted method of resolution, Kampfrecht, trial by battle. In the Holy Roman Empire, particularly in German-speaking regions, Kampfrecht was more than a legal oddity. It was structured, with rules differing by status. Nobles fought in armor, often on horseback. Burghers fought with cudgels or short swords. Peasants sometimes fought barehanded or with clubs. The notion remained the same. If you prevailed, your claim or defense was validated by divine will. In Nördlingen, a town large enough to host its own court but small enough to lack regular royal oversight, this method was not uncommon, yet it was feared. Hans was allowed to choose a kampfrichter, a witness or second to ensure fairness, but he could not avoid the fight. Nor could he afford to hire a champion, as some nobles did. His only option was to fight himself or admit guilt and accept punishment, which could include branding, exile, or loss of property. The duel was scheduled for the town square. A makeshift pit was prepared, a circular rope boundary about 15 feet across. It was to be a commoner's duel. No blades, just wooden staves. The winner would be the man left standing, conscious and within the ring. Hans spent the 3 nights before the duel in the town's jail, fed only bread and water, a standard rule intended to purify the body before God's test. He prayed. He trembled. He wondered how a man who had only ever shaped barrels would survive a beating at the hands of a younger, well-fed servant accustomed to lifting crates and swinging ropes. On the morning of the duel, the townsfolk gathered. This was part justice, part spectacle. Children climbed barrels for better views. Bakers brought fresh loaves to sell. The priest offered a blessing but no sermon. When the combat began, it was fast and violent. Hans took a blow to the ribs within seconds. He stumbled, gasped, nearly fell. But whether from desperation or divine favor, he managed a sweeping counterstrike, catching the servant's knee and unbalancing him. For nearly 10 minutes the 2 men struck, grappled, and flailed. There was no elegance, only exhaustion and pain. Finally, the servant fell backward outside the ring, his nose broken and his forehead split open. The town scribe recorded it plainly. The defendant did prevail and was released. Hans was free. His name was cleared, but he could no longer lift a hammer with his dominant arm, having dislocated his shoulder in the brawl. His cooper's work suffered. Within a year, he had moved to a nearby village to take up gardening. He had won his trial, but the cost was lifelong. These stories played out across Europe, from the stony squares of Italy to the forest clearings of Scotland. While the romanticized duels of knights captured later literature, the daily realities of legal combat among the lower classes were far grittier. Women, too, faced this system, though rarely. In rare but recorded cases in 14th century Saxony and Bohemia, women accused of serious crimes could be subjected to Kampfgericht. If the accuser was a man, the fight was staged with deliberate asymmetry to account for gender. The man would stand in a pit waist deep and fight with one arm tied behind his back, while the woman could move freely around the edge wielding a sack filled with stones. The outcome was no less serious. Guilt or innocence was declared not by logic but by impact. Yet over time, the practice began to recede. By the mid-13th century, pressures from the church, rising literacy, and the growth of bureaucratic governance began to favor written depositions and witness statements over brute force. Clerical scholars, trained in canon law, argued that trials must appeal to reason rather than arms. Theologians insisted that God's will should be discerned through truth and morality, not fists. One significant moment came in 1215, the same year as the duel in Lorraine, when the Fourth Lateran Council officially condemned the clergy's participation in ordeals. Though the ruling didn't ban trial by combat directly, it removed the church's sanction and cast doubt on its spiritual legitimacy. In France, royal courts began to displace feudal tribunals. In England, trial by jury gained preference over trial by battle, though technically the latter remained on the books for centuries. In the Empire, Kampfrecht continued longer, though increasingly marginalized. By the 15th century, legal duels had become theatrical relics performed mostly for honor, not justice. Still, the scars lingered. The people who fought not for glory but for innocence, coopers, widows, merchants, journeymen, carried those wounds quietly. History records few of their names, yet their stories whisper from the margins of court rolls and parish ledgers. They remind us that in the medieval world, justice was not abstract, it was embodied. And if you could not fight, if you were too old, too weak, too poor, then who spoke for you? Whose truth was heard? And what then was the meaning of justice at all? By the mid-14th century, trial by combat had already begun to fade from the legal systems of most European realms. And yet, the spectacle deeply embedded in feudal tradition refused to vanish entirely. While kings, bishops, and jurists debated the merits of legal reform, certain cases still found their way to the field. One of the most famous and final instances of a judicial duel sanctioned by a sovereign occurred in France in 1386, a case that enthralled the entire kingdom and was later immortalized in chronicles, ballads, and, centuries later, film. The trial by combat between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris. This was not a mere land dispute or a village quarrel. It was a case of rape, a rare instance where the voices of both the accused and the victim were carried all the way to the French Parliament and ultimately approved by King Charles VI himself. Lady Marguerite de Carouge, the wife of Jean, had accused Legris, a courtier and fellow knight, of assaulting her while her husband was away. The accusation was grave and the stakes enormous. At a time when women's testimonies were often dismissed, Marguerite's voice stood out both clear and unwavering. Yet, as was customary in noble courts, the matter quickly turned to a question of honor, truth, and reputation. Legris denied the charge entirely. With no physical evidence or third-party witnesses, the case stalled. The Parliament of Paris, after lengthy deliberation, sanctioned a judicial duel, invoking the old belief that God would reveal the truth through the outcome. This would be no crude brawl in a dusty village square. It was a state event, complete with royal protocol. The duel was held at the Abbey of Saint Martin des Champs, in a specially constructed arena before thousands of spectators, including the king himself. The rules were laid down carefully. Both men would appear in full plate armor. They would fight on horseback, then dismount if needed. The combat would continue until one of the two yielded, was incapacitated, or killed. If Carouge lost, Marguerite would be burned at the stake for false accusation. This last detail is often forgotten in the retellings. The duel was not just about two men. Marguerite's life and the legitimacy of her voice hung in the balance. The duel, as chronicled by Jean Froissart, was brutal and unrelenting. Both men delivered vicious blows with lances, then swords, then daggers. At one point, Carouge was thrown from his horse. Legris attempted to finish him, but Carouge reversed the momentum, striking Legris repeatedly until he forced a confession, or so the court interpreted his final silence. Carouge was declared victor. Legris was killed on the field. Marguerite was spared. Her accusation, validated by divine judgment, became a symbol of justice and bravery. And yet, many historians have since debated the case. Was Legris truly guilty, or was he simply the weaker fighter? Could a woman's voice ever truly find justice in such a system? This duel marked a turning point. Though duels continued to appear sporadically, particularly in Scotland and parts of the empire, their legal legitimacy rapidly declined. By the early 15th century, the prevailing belief among monarchs and magistrates was that justice must emerge from evidence, procedure, and reason, not the clash of steel. In England, the last sanctioned judicial duel occurred in 1446, when two commoners fought over an accusation of murder. Though trial by combat technically remained part of English law for centuries, only formally abolished in 1819, it had become symbolic, a phantom law, lingering in texts but not in practice. The decline of trial by combat was not sudden. It died in layers. Canon law, increasingly sophisticated, discredited ordeal-based methods. The rise of centralized courts shifted authority away from feudal lords. Roman legal traditions, rediscovered and embraced in universities, emphasized rational inquiry over divine judgment. And perhaps most importantly, the world was changing. Warfare had evolved. Plate armor gave way to firearms. The sword no longer ruled as it once had, and neither did its courtroom equivalent. In this transformation, justice moved from the battlefield to the written word. But for centuries, the belief that God would intervene would strengthen the innocent and strike down the guilty shaped the lives and fates of countless people, from barons to bakers. Some died believing they were right, others lived branded as false. And yet, even now, the idea echoes faintly in modern discourse in the language of fighting for justice, in the metaphor of trials by fire, and in the gut instinct that truth must prove itself through conflict. Was the end of trial by combat a victory of reason, or merely the loss of spectacle? Or perhaps, beneath the historical dust, we still wrestle with the same old question: who decides truth when the sword is silent? Story 3. The Wandering Justiciar. Enforcing law on the roads of Angevin, England. In the final years of the 12th century, the English countryside was in many ways lawless, not in the absence of laws, but in the irregularity of their enforcement. The rule of King Henry II had transformed the English legal landscape by establishing royal authority above that of barons, sheriffs, and church courts. Yet for all the king's ambition, it was not stone castles or parchment decrees that brought justice to the kingdom, it was the justiciar on the road. These men, known as itinerant justices or justiciarii itinerants, were the king's most mobile agents of law. They rode circuit across England with writs in hand and clerks at their sides, holding courts in market towns, abbeys, or even open fields. Where once the authority of law had been splintered between lords, bishops, and tradition, the itinerant justices brought the common law a legal framework that would eventually bind the whole kingdom. One such justice was Ralph of Glanville, a cleric, soldier, and confidant of Henry II. His name would later be attached somewhat inaccurately to the earliest surviving English legal treatise, Tractatus de Legibus et Consuetudinibus Regni Angliae. But more importantly, Ralph exemplified the generation of legal minds who believed the king's peace could, and should, reach every corner of the land. In the spring of 1181, Ralph and his small traveling court arrived in Lincolnshire, a shire rich in both harvest and disorder. Banditry had risen on the road between Lincoln and Stamford. Several village reeves were refusing to collect the scutage tax in lieu of military service. The local abbot was at odds with the sheriff over toll rights. And among it all, the peasants were caught in a web of confusion, forced to reckon with the king's justice in forms they had never encountered. The Eyre or Royal Circuit Court was a demanding affair. The justiciar would summon the local 100 courts, call forward jurors, and hear dozens of cases over the course of several days. These were not trials in the modern sense. Rather, they were Inquisition's investigations into crime, property rights, inheritance, and abuses of power. The system was revolutionary in its reliance on juries 12 free men from each 100, a division of a shire, sworn to report crimes and settle facts. This approach, pioneered under Henry II's reforms, was designed to counterbalance the old feudal methods, trial by ordeal, by battle, or by the will of lords. But juries were imperfect. They were prone to local bias, coercion, and sometimes fear. In Lincolnshire, Ralph encountered a troubling pattern. Several jurors hesitated to name local knights accused of violence. When pressed, they claimed ignorance. Ralph was unconvinced. He summoned additional recognitors, men of property from neighboring villages, to review the testimony. This method, recognitio, became a tool not only for justice, but for gathering intelligence. The justices were more than arbiters, they were royal eyes in places the king would never set foot. Among the cases brought before Ralph was a dispute involving a widow named Edith of Holbeach, whose late husband had died without heirs. She claimed the land by right of dower, a widow's portion, but her late husband's brother had seized the fields and refused her access. The local sheriff had done nothing. Ralph listened, consulted his clerks, and issued a writ ordering the sheriff to restore possession pending further judgment. This small act, hardly dramatic, was revolutionary. A woman of modest means had bypassed both lord and sheriff and found recourse in the king's name. But the justiciar's power was not without limits. After a week of hearings, Ralph prepared to ride south. Before leaving, he fined 2 reeves for failure to execute royal writs, ordered repairs to the bridge at Stamford, and left behind a clerk to monitor future complaints. Yet he could not stay. The circuit moved on toward Oxfordshire, toward Kent. And behind him, the old tensions remained. Some sheriffs bristled at the intrusion. Lords muttered about royal overreach. Even among the people there was unease. The king's law was consistent, but it was new, and new things were rarely welcome in a land shaped by custom. The roads Ralph traveled were slow and muddy. His records were written by candlelight, often on reused parchment. His guards were few. His judgments were sometimes reversed in court or ignored in practice. But still, the circuits continued. In time, the system would deepen. The office of Chief Justiciar would emerge as one of the most powerful in the realm, second only to the king. Judges would become more professional, their circuits more regular, and the principle that justice must be mobile, not fixed in castles or cathedrals, would endure. For now, Ralph rode on a figure not of grandeur, but of parchment and purpose. He was no knight, he bore no sword, but in a land of steel and superstition he carried something rarer. The idea that law could be applied equally to lords and villeins alike, not by the will of God, but by the will of the crown. Still, as Ralph approached the edge of the Shire, a question stirred in his thoughts, one that lingered in every county he visited. Could a law made in Westminster, truly, survive the winter fog and silence of the northern moors? By midsummer, Ralph of Glanville's judicial circuit reached Oxfordshire, where the countryside unfolded in tidy manorial patches and sheep clustered along dusty paths. It was a region of rising wealth, fed by wool exports and market charters. But with wealth came conflict, and with conflict came cases that only the royal justices could now untangle. Here, Ralph encountered the real burden of reform, the growing complexity of written law. Under King Henry II, and continued through the early reign of his son Richard I, justice had begun to take a new shape: documentary, portable, and centralized. Royal writs, standardized legal instructions issued under the king's seal, were now flooding the countryside. Each writ initiated a legal action, such as a claim to land or a summons to court. For the illiterate, which included most villagers and minor nobles alike, these slips of parchment were both powerful and mysterious. One case in Wallingford exemplified this tension. A landholder named Simon of Blueberry had enclosed a strip of land between his estate and a neighboring common pasture. The village reeve protested. Simon, in turn, produced a royal writ affirming his rights. When brought before Ralph's court, the problem emerged. Simon's writ was genuine, but its interpretation was not. He had deliberately misrepresented its scope, using vague boundaries to claim rights over land used for grazing by others. To untangle the matter, Ralph relied on a legal innovation that had only recently taken hold: the assize of novel disseisin, a royal procedure designed to quickly resolve cases where land had been seized unlawfully. It relied on the testimony of neighbors, not oaths or ordeals. It emphasized evidence, however rudimentary, over vengeance. 12 jurors, free men from nearby villes, were sworn in. Their memories became the trial. How long had the hedges been in place? Who used the pasture before? Did Simon ever contest its use prior to fencing it off? After a day of testimony and deliberation, Ralph ruled against Simon. The land was returned to common use. Simon was fined for false representation. It was not the sword that had decided the matter, but the spoken word, preserved in writing. The power of the written word. For many, the rapid expansion of royal justice introduced a form of alienation. Legal Latin flowed in the margins of daily life. Scribes, often clerics, held disproportionate power. Even the format of documents, their length, the placement of seals, the phrasing of dates could determine whether a complaint was accepted or rejected. Ralph's own clerks had to copy proceedings onto membranae, long rolls of parchment designed to be transported to Westminster for archiving. These would eventually become part of what historians know as the plea rolls, records of cases that formed the backbone of English common law. But the growing bureaucracy was not universally welcomed. In Banbury, Ralph encountered open resistance. The town's burgesses, proud of their newly acquired charter, argued that they were exempt from certain tolls and duties levied by the sheriff. When Ralph ordered the town reeve to produce the charter, it was found in poor condition, gnawed at the corners, its seal half broken. The dispute was not just about the content of the charter, it was about its authenticity. Ralph, ever cautious, deferred judgment and sent the charter to Westminster for verification against royal chancery records. This act reflected a larger truth. Justice no longer lived entirely in the countryside. It had taken root in London, in scriptoria and stone halls, where records were copied and preserved, and where the king's seal had final say. Shield tensions with local lords. Despite Ralph's steady hand and preference for consistency, his presence in the shires often ignited simmering resentment. Many barons viewed the justices as intruders, undermining traditional authority. In one instance near Bampton, a local knight, Sir Oswin de Chercy, refused to attend Ralph's heir after being summoned on a charge of unlawfully imprisoning a tenant. Instead, he sent a message through a retainer. "Let the king judge from his throne. I judge from mine." Ralph responded by seizing Oswin's manor revenue until he complied. This ability to enforce through the purse, rather than the sword, marked a departure from previous centuries. No longer did disputes escalate immediately into blood feuds. Increasingly, they became battles of record, debt, and fine. But enforcement remained uneven. In some counties, sheriffs aligned with the justices. In others, they were entrenched opponents, loyal more to local barons than to the king's writ. Ralph navigated these waters with care. He understood that royal justice, to endure, could not rely solely on authority. It had to build credibility. Each fair ruling, each restored land, each protected widow contributed to a growing belief in the value of the system. Justice and the ordinary person. One of the most overlooked impacts of the wandering justiciar was how his presence legitimized the voices of the poor. In Burford, a villain named Matthew appeared before Ralph to contest a beating he received from his manor's bailiff. Under feudal custom, villains had few rights. They were unfree, bound to the land. But Matthew claimed the attack was excessive and unprovoked. While local lords scoffed at the idea of a villain appearing in a royal court, Ralph allowed it. His rationale was simple but revolutionary. If the king's peace was broken, status did not excuse the act. Though Matthew ultimately lost, no witnesses could be found. His case was heard, recorded, and treated seriously. Such moments, while rare, chipped away at the old assumptions of hereditary justice. The fragility of reform. Despite these advances, Ralph knew that justice remained fragile. Records were lost in rain-soaked saddlebags, corrupt sheriffs suppressed writs, barons pressured jurors, roads flooded, illness struck. More than once, Ralph's clerks had to abandon sessions due to dysentery or wolf attacks on the return route. And yet the work continued. For Ralph, it was not glory that drove the circuit, but the slow shaping of a system. One where law was not dependent on a man's lineage or a lord's temper, but on form, precedent, and the ink that dried beneath a wax seal. Still, at every village boundary, he faced the same truth. A verdict delivered is not the same as a verdict accepted. And so he asked, as the wheels of his cart turned slowly through the dust of August, would the law endure not just in parchment, but in practice? By autumn of 1181, Ralph of Glanville had reached the last stage of his judicial heir in the shires. He and his retinue entered Kent, a county of prosperous market towns and well-traveled roads, but also a place marked by old privileges and new resistance. Kent was unusual. Its inhabitants claimed a variety of customary rights, some dating back to Norman times and others even older. The locals asserted that, unlike in the rest of England, land could descend through gavelkind, a form of inheritance where property was divided equally among sons. This challenged the royal legal reforms that aimed to standardize inheritance through primogeniture. For Ralph, these local customs were not obstacles but data points. He recorded them, he compared them, and then he judged. It was this kind of legal adaptability, balancing royal norms with regional practice, that gave the common law its durability. The law of the king was not enforced through fire and steel, but through reason, precedent, and deliberate bureaucracy. Of the king's peace as legal geography. One of the most powerful legal concepts to emerge in this period was the king's peace, Pax Regis. Originally referring to the personal protection extended by the monarch to specific persons or places, such as roads, markets, or religious sites, it had evolved into a legal shield. If a crime was committed under the king's peace, it fell within royal jurisdiction, meaning the case could be tried by a royal court rather than a lord's. The expansion of this idea was both brilliant and strategic. By defining more places and people as being within the king's peace, the crown steadily extended its reach. In Kent, Ralph presided over a case that revealed just how deliberate this expansion had become. A traveling tinker named Godric had been murdered near a toll gate outside Canterbury. The assailant, a former soldier turned mercenary, had fled to the safety of a local lord's estate. Normally, such a killing might have been left to the feud-based justice of local custom. Godric's kin, if any, might seek blood vengeance or compensation. But the site of the murder near a market road, under royal charter, meant the crime occurred within the king's peace. That small legal distinction changed everything. Ralph ordered an investigation. The accused was traced, captured, and brought before the circuit court. The evidence, gathered through local reports and the testimony of the toll keeper, supported the charge. The man was hanged. Justice, once a matter of family retaliation or baronial whim, had been rendered in the name of the crown. Such rulings sent ripples throughout the region. Markets were safer, tolls were more reliable, and slowly the idea took root that justice came not from blood but from the king. Challenges from the church. Yet no justiciar in Angevin, England, operated without challenge, especially from the church. Ecclesiastical courts claimed exclusive authority over clerics, widows, orphans, and matters of sin. This often placed them in jurisdictional conflict with royal justices. In Rochester, Ralph encountered a tangled case involving a clerk accused of forging a charter to seize control of a local glebe, the land reserved for the parish priest. The bishop's court demanded the man be tried in canon law. Ralph argued that forgery of royal documents fell under royal jurisdiction, regardless of the accused's status. The standoff was tense. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. The clerk would be tried by the royal court, but his punishment, if found guilty, would be limited to fines and loss of property, not corporal punishment, in deference to his ecclesiastical status. It was a small but telling example of the negotiation, constantly at play, between competing systems of authority. Justice for whom? Despite these advances, Ralph understood that justice was not yet equal. Wealthier litigants could travel to London, hire scribes, or influence juries. Poorer subjects, especially villeins and cottars, had little understanding of their rights under the common law. Even those who won their cases might struggle to enforce the judgment. In Aylesford, a woman named Mildred, who had successfully recovered her dower rights in Ralph's court, returned 6 weeks later to report that her deceased husband's nephew had reoccupied the land, ignoring the ruling. Ralph's clerks issued a second writ. This time, the sheriff was fined for failing to act. But how many other Mildreds were there who lacked the stamina, resources, or support to follow through? Justice was growing, but it was not yet fully planted. Legacy of the Justiciar's Road. When Ralph of Glanville died, likely in the mid-1190s, he left no grand tomb, but his legacy endured. The legal circuit he helped systematize became the model for centuries of English judicial administration. The treatise attributed to him, though probably penned by clerks under his direction, preserved the doctrines of the early common law and was used as a teaching tool well into the 13th century. His belief that justice must travel, rather than wait to be sought, shaped a legal philosophy that still defines much of the English-speaking world. Over time, the office of the justiciar faded, absorbed into other institutions. But the idea of a mobile, responsive legal system remained. In the muddy footprints of Ralph's horse, in the wax seals left on borrowed tables, and in the breathless Latin scrawled by candlelight, we glimpse something rare in medieval history. An effort not just to rule, but to govern through structure, fairness, and form. Yet even as the common law spread, Ralph might have asked, in his final days, would those who followed remember the justice, or only the judgment? Story 4: A Debt of Salt. Justice in a Sicilian fishing town. In the year 1292, along the sun-bleached southern coast of Sicily, the small fishing town of Saiaca was gripped not by the sea's fury, but by a legal crisis involving the most mundane of commodities: salt. Salt in medieval Europe was not merely a preservative, it was a lifeline. It allowed fishers to cure their catch, merchants to preserve meats for trade, and rural communities to endure the lean months of winter. But in Sicily, a land rich with salt pans and contested by rulers both local and foreign, salt was also a symbol of control. And where there is control, there is resistance. In Saiaca, the salt tax had been a source of friction for years. First imposed by the Norman rulers, then expanded under the Angevin kings, the levy required all salt produced or traded to be taxed at a fixed rate, payable to the crown. The administration of the tax fell to a royal-appointed official known as the gabellato, or salt tax farmer. This figure held broad authority, setting rates, enforcing payments, and, as was often the case, extorting favors or bribes from those too poor to challenge him. In the summer of 1292, the gabellato was a man named Taddeo Calavrese, a bureaucrat from Palermo sent south to administer the salt levy. He was disliked, but feared more than hated. Taddeo rarely appeared in public without an escort, and he lodged in the home of the local podesta, magistrate, securing his status with both law and coin. Trouble began when a respected fisherman, Gianni Ortolano, was summoned to Taddeo's quarters and accused of concealing salt. The charge, that he had failed to declare 3 sacks of salt used to preserve mackerel sold to a trader from Tunis. Gianni denied the accusation, claiming the salt had been purchased legally and taxed at the nearby station in Mazzara del Vallo. But the records were missing, and the trader was gone. Gianni was detained, and worse still, his boats were seized by the gabellato's guards, rendering him economically paralyzed in a town where no catch meant no coin. The case, minor in the eyes of the kingdom, rattled the town. Gianni was no agitator. He was known for his quiet demeanor, his piety, and his honesty in trade. The locals whispered that this wasn't about salt, it was about control. Salt and law in the Kingdom of Sicily. Under the Angevin dynasty, which had ruled Sicily since Charles of Anjou's conquest in 1266, the legal system was a strange hybrid. The old Norman laws, Latinized and codified by Frederick II in the Liber Augustalis, still influenced the courts. But French officials imported from Naples or Marseille brought with them newer bureaucratic procedures. In theory, there were royal courts, staffed by trained judges to hear cases of fraud or tax disputes. But in practice, such courts were distant, inconsistent, and often overshadowed by local custom or magisterial discretion. In Sciacca, the podesta, Alfonso di Martino, held civil jurisdiction. He was expected to mediate between royal officials and townspeople, a delicate balance. But Alfonso had grown increasingly reliant on Taddio's favor, especially in matters of grain tariffs and port permissions. The two men shared wine, lodgings, and a suspicion of the townsfolk's loyalty. When Gianni's family petitioned the court to release his boats, citing wrongful seizure, Alfonso dismissed the case as pending royal review. Meanwhile, the boats remained impounded, and Gianni languished in a cell built to hold drunks and smugglers. What made this case unusual was not the salt, but what followed. The voice of the town. 3 days after Gianni's arrest, a delegation of townspeople, mostly elders, merchants, and the abbot of Santa Maria della Raccomandata, gathered in the central piazza. They composed a petition, carefully worded, addressed not to Alfonso or even to Taddio, but to the royal chamberlain of Palermo. The letter, signed by 15 men and sealed with wax from the abbot's ring, alleged that Taddio was misusing royal authority to punish honest traders and enrich himself. It demanded an inquiry and warned of quiet unrest in the port towns should such injustices persist. The letter was risky. In Angevin Sicily, complaints against royal officers could be viewed as sedition. But the writers relied on a clever legal maneuver. They invoked the authority of the king not in defiance, but in defense of the king's law. They argued that Taddio was acting against royal interest by strangling the economy of a loyal town. This reframing justice not as rebellion, but as restoration of royal order was a tool increasingly used by local communities across Europe during this period. The petition was smuggled north by a merchant bound for Palermo, and then the town waited. Meanwhile, justice at home. While awaiting word from Palermo, Gianni's family turned to an ancient form of legal resistance, public fasting and witness processions. His wife, Lucetta, took her children to the cathedral steps each morning, carrying a small cross and sitting in silence. Local fishermen began leaving salted mackerel wrapped in cloth at the church door, symbols of solidarity and subtle protest. At night, songs were whispered through alleys, canzone di doglianza, laments of unjust seizure. These forms of resistance, though quiet, were powerful. They signaled that justice was not forgotten, even when courts refused to hear. A letter returned. 3 weeks later, a rider arrived from Palermo with a sealed letter bearing the royal stamp. The chamberlain had received the petition. The response was brief and formal, but astonishingly rare. An auditor would be dispatched to investigate the matter. Taddio, upon hearing this, reportedly turned white. He dismissed 2 guards and left the magistrate's house that same day. Within a week, he departed Sciacca entirely, claiming a summons back to Palermo. The auditor, a notary named Ser Angelo di Trapani, arrived a few days later. He reviewed salt records, trade logs, and spoke with townspeople. He found inconsistencies in Taddio's assessments and confirmed that Gianni had, in fact, paid the Mazzara salt tax. The receipt had been misfiled in a separate ledger. Gianni was released, his boats were returned. And in a gesture almost unheard of in royal administration, the court declared that excess levies must be reimbursed not just to Gianni, but to others who could show proof of overpayment. Echoes and questions. The salt levy remained in place, of course, and new gabellati would come, but something had changed. The people of Sciacca had used the tools of royal justice, documents, petitions, processions to push back against its abuses, not its existence. They had fought injustice from within the law, not against it. Still, as Lucetta watched Gianni return to the sea with his nets and barrels, she must have wondered how many others, less visible, were still lost beneath the weight of unseen taxes and unspoken threats. By the time Ser Angelo di Trapani completed his investigation in Sciacca, the town had returned to a cautious normalcy. The sea was still rough in the early autumn winds, but the markets buzzed with renewed energy. Salt barrels returned to circulation, and Gianni Ortolano once again sold his catch along the port's stone docks. But the story did not end with his release. In fact, the events that followed revealed the deeper legal contradictions of the Kingdom of Sicily, a land where justice, though granted, could never be taken for granted. The auditor's ledger. Ser Angelo was not a judge. He was a royal notary auditor, sent to inspect accounts and verify compliance with the kingdom's fiscal rules. But his tools, pen, parchment, and a stamped book of accounting had as much power as any magistrate's hammer. After confirming that Gianni's taxes had been paid in Mazzara, Ser Angelo requested 3 years' worth of salt levy records from Taddio's tenure. What he discovered was more than a few clerical errors. Several traders' entries were duplicated, suggesting double taxation. Others were missing entirely, yet the physical ledgers recorded payments. In one case, a fisherman had died in debt, his boat seized, despite no record of any formal debt. The salt tax, it seemed, had become a personal revenue stream for Taddio and his circle. But there was a problem. Taddio, now back in Palermo, remained officially in office. No formal charges had been filed, and no court had yet ruled on the matter. Ser Angelo's authority ended at accounting. To press further required legal action in a royal court, and the wheels of justice in Palermo turned slowly. So the question loomed: could wrongdoing documented but not punished still be called justice? The return of debt. Meanwhile, the townspeople of Sciacca, emboldened by Ser Angelo's visit, began submitting their own petitions. The local church opened its doors for complaint hearings, where scribes assisted villagers in writing their claims. These were bundled and sent to the chancery office in Palermo. One widow, Allegra Di Naro, provided a detailed account of how her late husband, a cooper, had paid a salt tariff for barrels that were never used. The barrels, claimed by Taddio's men for spoiled salt, had then been sold again through a cousin of the Gabellato. Allegra's petition demanded restitution of 4 denarii, a small but symbolic sum. Another claim came from Vincenzo, a Moorish merchant, who alleged that Taddio had imposed a foreign trader's duty on North African buyers, a fee not recognized in any royal edict. The patterns were consistent, and so was the silence from Palermo. Ser Angelo, his work complete, departed Sciacca with a thick packet of documents and a polite farewell. But his absence left a void. Without the active presence of an auditor, the Podesta and his allies began reasserting local authority. In the weeks that followed, minor officials loyal to the old system began to discourage new petitions. Traders were told that their complaints would be considered treasonous if not proved. Scribes who had helped write grievances were quietly dismissed from the church's employ. And once again the tension thickened. The limits of law. One of the paradoxes of medieval Sicilian governance, especially under the Angevin regime, was that royal law was expansive, but its implementation was highly localized. Palermo, the seat of government, was more than 100 miles away. Royal courts were few. Their judges, often trained in Naples or the Papal States, were overworked and unfamiliar with rural norms. Thus, while the kingdom boasted one of the most advanced legal codifications in Europe, drawing on Roman law, Norman custom, and papal doctrine, it lacked the administrative capacity to enforce it uniformly. This created what historians call patchwork justice. In one town, like Sciacca, a wrong might be corrected for a brief time, In another, it might never be acknowledged. Even within the same province, two families might experience the king's law in entirely different ways, depending on the personality of their local official. It also meant that accountability was temporary. Taddeo, though exposed, was never prosecuted. He quietly relinquished his role but remained in royal service. His cousin, Girolamo, soon appeared in Saica as the new Gaebolato. He was more cautious, more polite, but the mechanisms of power remained intact. Gianni's bargain. Gianni Ortolano, for his part, refused to take his case further. Though Sir Angelo had advised him that he could claim damages for his lost income, Gianni declined. "I have my boat," he reportedly said, "and my hands, that is enough." Instead, he focused on rebuilding trust with traders and neighbors. He helped Lucetta establish a communal salt storage behind the church, protected from confiscation by its religious association. He offered salted fish at reduced prices to the poor. Slowly, his name became a symbol of honesty in Saica's port. But he remained wary. When asked by a visiting merchant if he would ever challenge the Gaebolato again, he replied, "Not unless the wind carries a judge." Salt as symbol. The story of salt in Saica is not merely about taxation. It is about how everyday goods, grain, fish, wood, and salt became the battlegrounds for structural justice. In the medieval world, justice was rarely about grand proclamations. It was about control over the ordinary, who may fish, who may trade, who may keep what they produce. Salt was small, cheap, and invisible once used. But because it touched every barrel, every meal, and every trade route, it became a perfect object for invisible corruption, and sometimes quiet resistance. The law ebbs and flows. By winter, the royal court had acknowledged receipt of the petitions. Some claimants were told to await further review. Others heard nothing. The podesta remained in office, and the salt levy continued, albeit with fewer seizures. Justice had come to Saica in part. But like the tide, it had receded. And so the town watched the horizon, wondering, when would it return? By the early weeks of 1293, the town of Saica stood as a place that had experienced the rare brush of justice, brief, imperfect, and fragile. While Gianni Ortolano's ordeal had ended with his release, and the abusive Gaebolato Taddeo Calavries had been quietly removed, the underlying system of economic control through taxation remained untouched. And yet, in the weeks and months that followed, something more subtle began to take shape. A new pattern of legal survival, woven not through rebellion or riots, but through quiet, coordinated action by the townspeople themselves. The Brotherhood of the Salt House. Gianni, though reluctant to speak publicly after his release, began working informally with other fishers and merchants to establish a rotating salt coffer, a private reserve of salt held collectively by trusted families. This informal salt house was constructed on church-owned land behind the Abbey of Santa Maria della Raccomandata, placing it under ecclesiastical protection. By associating the stockpile with charitable provisioning, it gained a layer of legal shielding from seizure. The salt was distributed based on need, and records were kept not in Latin, not by a royal scribe, but by Giorgio, the town's blind cantor, who recited and memorized the allotments in song. This oral record-keeping system was both a cultural tradition and a legal strategy. If questioned, there were no documents to confiscate or destroy, only oaths, memory, and a community of shared interest. Justice reimagined. While no new royal justices visited Saica in the months that followed, something had shifted in how the townspeople conceptualized justice. Instead of looking to Palermo or to the podesta, they increasingly turned inward to collective responsibility, public rituals, and mutual aid. 3 developments illustrated this shift. Public arbitration. Disputes between neighbors, fishers, and traders began to be resolved by trusted elders, often within the church's courtyard or at the communal oven. These informal sessions mimicked court proceedings, listening to claims, weighing witness oaths, but ended with a communal decision, sealed by a shared meal or prayer. Selective compliance. Traders in the port began underreporting salt quantities, but in coordination with scribes who ensured that some level of tax was still collected. This managed noncompliance allowed officials to maintain appearances while reducing the economic pressure on locals. Civic rituals as memory, Gianni's story and the salt dispute entered the oral tradition. Children sang verses that began, "In barrels brine the truth was hid until a writer came unbid." These weren't just rhymes. They were legal memory passed through voice when ink could not be trusted. The sea does not forget. Even as the town turned inward, Palermo did not disappear. New royal clerks occasionally passed through Saica, collecting levies and surveying trade. But none stayed long, and none asked questions about Taddeo. It became clear to Gianni and others that the central government preferred distance, a kind of strategic ignorance that allowed quiet systems to function so long as no violence erupted, and the tax coffers remained acceptably filled. This tension between local justice and central neglect defined many Mediterranean communities in the late 13th century. Sicily, ruled from afar by foreign kings, was a land of complex loyalties. Norman laws, Arab customs, Byzantine echoes, and Latin scripture all layered beneath a French court. In such a place, justice was never a destination. It was a navigation, a way of moving carefully between tides. The abbot's final note. Before his death in 1296, Abbot Maurizio, the churchman who had signed the original petition for Gianni's release, penned a letter to the Bishop of Agrigento. In it, he described the events in Saica as a lesson in humility. The law of man arrived like lightning, struck its mark, and vanished. The people, however, built a fire from the ashes and warmed themselves by it. They no longer wait for the king's riders. They listen for each other. His letter was filed in the diocesan archives, largely unread for decades, but it captured a reality familiar to many rural communities of the time, that the impact of justice was measured not by the swiftness of verdicts, but by the endurance of memory. The salt in the story. Salt itself remained a symbol of burden for those taxed beyond survival, of preservation for the traditions and quiet solidarities that held the town together, of truth, which like salt can sting a wound before it heals. By the century's end, Saica had experienced no great revolts, no dramatic reforms, but the events surrounding Gianni Ortolano's trial and release had seeded something more enduring. A culture of quiet resistance, embedded within law, ritual, and shared memory. And so we ask, standing where the Mediterranean meets the stone quay of Saica, when the courts forget and the scribes fall silent, is memory enough to preserve justice? Story 5: Chains and Mercy. The Forgotten Pardons of the Carolingian Empire. In the year 814, the Emperor Charlemagne died, leaving behind an empire vast in territory but fragile in cohesion. Stretching from the Atlantic to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Pyrenees, the Carolingian Empire was held together by oath, ritual, and scribes far more than by iron or coin. Among the many tools of governance inherited by his son, Louis the Pious, was an institution both ancient and underappreciated: the royal pardon. To pardon a criminal, especially one already sentenced or imprisoned, might seem a sign of weakness in a feudal world shaped by vengeance and retribution. Yet in the Carolingian court, mercy was power, and pardons were not anomalies, they were policy. But as with all things in this early medieval empire, mercy was neither simple nor evenly applied. The mechanics of pardon. In theory, royal pardons in the Carolingian world were based on a mix of Roman legal tradition and Christian theology. The emperor, as a Christian king, was expected to act not only as a judge but as a shepherd, stern when needed, but merciful when the soul repented. Pardons were typically issued in three situations: on religious festivals, especially Easter, Pentecost, or Christmas; upon royal accession, as Louis did when ascending the throne in 814, freeing numerous prisoners in Aachen and Reims; by petition through personal letters from bishops, nobles, or abbots requesting clemency for a subject, often including oaths of future obedience. These petitions were written in carefully stylized Latin, sent through royal messengers, and recorded in chancery rolls now only partially preserved. One such preserved document, dated 817, contains a plea from Abbot Theodoric of Corbie, asking for the release of a former monk named Reynold, imprisoned after a dispute turned violent in a northern village. The abbot wrote, "He has erred, yes, but he has labored with tears and silence. Let not the chain harden his heart more than the Lord's rebuke already has." The letter ends with a subtle appeal to Louis's spiritual responsibility, not just his imperial duty. The emperor granted the pardon. Reynold was released under the condition that he return to monastic service and surrender his right to hold land. Justice in an age of oaths. This practice of pardon existed within a broader Carolingian legal system, marked by personal bonds, sworn oaths, and capitularies' royal decrees, meant to unify legal standards across diverse regions. Yet enforcement was deeply inconsistent. The empire had no standing police force, no system of prisons as we would understand them. Punishments varied: fines for the wealthy, mutilation or exile for the poor. Many legal cases were settled through compurgation, oath-swearing by peers, or ordeal by fire or water. Appeals to the king were rare and often reserved for the powerful or well-connected. This meant that the royal pardon served as both remedy and symbol, a way for the emperor to correct abuses, to soften harsh sentences, or to assert personal favor in a political web constantly shifting between loyalty and rebellion. But the system was not without cynicism. Mercy for a price. Not all pardons were spiritual in origin. Some came with gifts: horses, grain, manuscripts, or political advantages. Nobles requested pardons not only for faithful servants but for troublesome vassals whose continued imprisonment risked rebellion. In Aquitaine, a count named Berenger sought clemency for a captain who had led a failed border raid. His letter offered service in arms in return. Louis granted the request, and the man returned to military command. To modern eyes, this appears transactional, but in the Carolingian context, relationships trumped law. The empire was too vast, too fragmented for central authority to function without cooperation. The pardon was a diplomatic tool disguised as moral generosity. The forgotten prisoners. For every recorded pardon, there were likely dozens never written down. Prisoners held in manor dungeons, in monastic cells, or even in semi-permanent stockades on royal estates often disappeared from view. Their names were not recorded. Their crimes were assumed. Their fates were left to local lords. Occasionally, a monk or a court scribe would mention them obliquely. In a chronicle from St. Gall, a marginal note reads, "A certain woman from the valley of Limmat was held for theft. Her husband made pilgrimage to Aachen, but she was not seen again. We do not know her name. We do not know whether her husband's appeal was heard, but we know she existed because someone thought to record even that much." Such entries are rare, yet vital. They show that even in a Christian empire, mercy often depended not on guilt or repentance, but on proximity to power. The emperor's image. Louis the Pious took his role as a Christian ruler seriously. He held public penance for his sins, sponsored ecclesiastical reform, and promoted moral governance. Pardons, in this light, were both acts of compassion and public theater displays of humility and clemency meant to inspire awe and obedience. But such mercy also raised difficult questions. What of victims? What of deterrence? If a man could buy or beg his freedom, did the law mean anything at all? These questions would haunt later medieval rulers, and indeed continue to echo today. For now, in 820s Francia, the royal court in Aachen continued to issue pardons, some fair, some bought, some forgotten. And in the margins of surviving scrolls, we find traces of this delicate, deliberate mercy. Chains broken not by justice, but by appeal. And so we ask, was mercy a strength, or simply a softer mask for the same old power? In the years following the death of Charlemagne, the issuance of pardons by his son Louis the Pious and later by his grandsons became both more frequent and more politically fraught. The empire was fracturing, not yet by swords, but by parchment and petition. By the 830s, rival factions within the Carolingian aristocracy began using the mechanisms of mercy, not merely to forgive crimes, but to strengthen alliances. And nowhere is this clearer than in the records of monastic letters, where monks, abbots, and even abbesses acted as legal intermediaries, writing with calculated humility to secure the release of individuals from incarceration or corporal punishment. The structure of a pardon letter. Most petitions for mercy followed a careful structure. These were not emotional pleas, but rhetorically precise instruments meant to appeal to the king's legal and spiritual responsibilities. A typical letter might include a salutation, emphasizing loyalty and invoking divine blessing; a summary of the offender's misdeed, often downplayed or attributed to misunderstanding; an emphasis on repentance, including signs of penance already performed; a moral appeal, drawing from Christian doctrine; a political or social assurance such as oaths, land surrender, or religious service to prevent recurrence. A surviving letter from Abbot Hilduin of Saint-Denis, dated around 833, pleads for the release of a young man named Aymer, imprisoned for desertion during a Frankish campaign near the Loire. His heart is sorrowful, his hands calloused from fasting, and his tongue cleaves to the roof of his mouth in prayers for the mercy of the august emperor, whose justice walks with mercy as a twin-born sibling. Such language was both poetic and practical. Hilduin was no naive scribe, he was a key advisor at court, and his words were chosen to move the king, not shame him. Aymer was released, but the letter survives as a rare record of how mercy was brokered through language, status, and timing. The role of the Church in mercy. The Carolingian Church did not merely advocate for mercy, it actively shaped its meaning. In cathedral schools and monastic scriptoria, clerics copied Roman law alongside commentaries from church fathers like Augustine and Ambrose. Mercy was considered a Christian virtue, especially when the soul had repented. But it also had a social function. By advocating for clemency, the Church expanded its influence over secular law. A bishop who could persuade the king to spare a prisoner gained both spiritual prestige and political favor. Some even used this to extract concessions. For instance, a charter preserved at the Abbey of Lourdes shows that, in exchange for a pardon, a noblewoman donated 2 vineyards and a herd of sheep to the monastery, a pious transaction, with legal consequence. Meanwhile, the Church also developed penitential systems that offered alternatives to corporal punishment. Instead of branding or mutilation, a thief might be sentenced to pilgrimage, extended fasting, or monastic servitude. This wasn't always merciful. In practice, monastic labor was grueling, and pilgrims risked robbery or death, but it marked a shift from punitive justice to corrective penance. Still, the question remained: whose repentance counted? The prisoners who went unheard. While noble offenders and monastic petitioners had access to the emperor's court, many others did not. The records of capitulary courts, regional gatherings of legal agents, show that peasants, servants, and foreigners were often tried and punished without any route to appeal. Punishments included fines often impossible for a poor man to pay, exile especially for political dissenters or those convicted of sacrilege, mutilation, particularly of the hands or nose, as a permanent mark of guilt, public humiliation, including flogging or shamming rituals. Royal pardons for such cases are exceedingly rare. Even when local clergy attempted to intervene, they often lacked the authority to compel mercy unless sponsored by a superior. A case from Towle, recorded in a bishop's letter, tells of a carpenter accused of striking a noble's servant during a dispute over wages. The carpenter was imprisoned, and the bishop's plea for his release was denied because his station made his guilt more certain. The carpenter's fate is unknown, but the bishop's frustration is clear. Mercy was not blind, it was selective. The politics of penance. During the Lotharingian crisis of the 840s, when Charlemagne's grandsons vied for territory, the pardon became not just a tool of compassion but a political strategy. Rival kings issued blanket amnesties to rebels to win their loyalty. Former traitors were welcomed back into courts if they pledged military service. Bishops played kingmakers, offering to forgive sins in exchange for legal favors. In some ways, the practice of royal mercy undermined justice. If a noble could rebel one year and be forgiven the next, what incentive did law have? But in a world where legitimacy was contested, mercy was currency, and the pardon letter was its coin. Mercy as a mirror. As the Carolingian Empire fractured, many of its central institutions faded. The capital at Aachen lost its administrative grip. Charters became inconsistent. Capitularies were less enforced. But the idea of mercy, anchored in faith and reinforced by political necessity, survived. Indeed, it would continue into the High Middle Ages, finding expression in the papal indulgence systems of the Crusades, the pardoning powers of medieval kings like Henry II of England or Philip IV of France, the custom of royal grace, often issued during coronations or after great battles. But the Carolingian moment was unique, a time when mercy was experimental, uncertain, and closely tied to personal relationships. And so we must ask, was mercy a tool to forgive or to forget? And who decides which chains are broken and which are merely hidden beneath robes and rings? By the late 9th century, as the Carolingian Empire strained under the weight of internal division, Viking incursions, and dynastic rivalry, the institutional foundations that supported royal pardons began to weaken. Yet for a brief, flickering period, the concept of mercy as a mechanism of governance had left an indelible imprint on the character of early medieval rule. As Emperor Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, struggled to hold together the western portion of the empire in the 850s and 860s, the use of pardons became both more frequent and less stable. No longer confined to careful ritual or theological petition, clemency became a reactive tool granted swiftly to secure allies, hush dissent, or reverse judicial missteps in times of crisis. And this instability is perhaps best captured not in grand annals, but in the incomplete, water-stained scrolls of regional chancelleries, where names, dates, and notations of clemency now exist only in fragments. The last letters of the court. Among the last coherent documents attributed to the court of Charles the Bald is a pardon dated 867, issued to a man named Ermengarde, a minor noble from the region of Toulouse, who had been imprisoned after a failed rebellion against a royal tax collector. The pardon, addressed to the Bishop of Albi, reads, "Let it be known that, in the interest of concord and the restoration of peace among the noble houses of the South, we remit the sentence of confinement upon the man Ermengarde, that he may serve henceforth in loyalty, and pay the crown's due with faithful heart." No penance was assigned, no theological reasoning was included. It was, quite plainly, a political calculation. Ermengarde returned to his estates, but was later implicated in a second uprising. This time, he was executed without trial. The failure of his pardon was not unique. When mercy fails, as royal power became increasingly contested not only by rebellious magnates, but by regional bishops, counts, and foreign incursions, the royal pardon lost much of its force. In places like Aquitaine, Burgundy, and Lotharingia, the power to grant mercy quietly drifted from the emperor to regional lords. These new lords had neither the scriptoria nor the scribes to maintain the formal ritual of clemency. Instead, forgiveness became oral, a handshake at a feast, a whispered vow in the corridor of a monastery, a pledge of arms rather than an act of grace. A surviving capitulary fragment from the court of Louis, the German ruler of East Francia, instructs local counts to exercise clemency in matters of theft or feuding, where it serves the peace. But no centralized process is described. The emperor's mercy was now filtered through others, fragmented across political factions and personal interests. In this new world, mercy no longer radiated outward from the throne. It had become a currency of the countryside, traded between local powers, granted, revoked, and remembered only in song or rumor. What the records do not tell. The surviving royal rolls of the Carolingian Empire are uneven, often torn, and overwhelmingly focused on the concerns of men with land. For every formal pardon preserved, there are dozens of stories missing. A servant executed for bearing false witness, whose lord later claimed the testimony was coerced. A nun imprisoned in a manorial dungeon for leaving her cloister without permission. A group of peasants who fled their bonded lands during a famine, only to be pardoned by a bishop and recaptured by their lord a year later. These stories survive only in marginalia, in monastic chronicles, or through indirect references in charters and lawsuits. They reveal a disconnect, a world where mercy was proclaimed from above, but rarely secured from below. And yet, even in silence, these absences speak. They tell us that mercy was conditional. It depended on a name, a seal, a connection, or a favor owed. It was not the impartial right of a citizen, but the fortunate accident of a relationship. Legacy of a fractured grace. Despite its gradual erosion, the Carolingian concept of clemency influenced later medieval systems. In the Capetian monarchy of France, pardons remained tied to royal festivals and political settlements. In the Holy Roman Empire, emperors granted clemency during coronations or imperial diets, often in exchange for loyalty oaths. In England, the idea of the king's mercy was codified in law and shaped the evolving balance between justice and executive discretion. But in all these places, the Carolingian precedent lingered, that a ruler might demonstrate legitimacy not through conquest or decree alone, but through the measured, visible act of forgiveness. And still, the questions that haunted Louis the Pious in Aachen remained unanswered. When does mercy undermine law? When does it restore it? And what is the moral cost of mercy without memory pardons granted and forgotten, with no reckoning of the causes that led to punishment in the first place? The final thought. As the Carolingian world fractured into a mosaic of kingdoms and counties, the chains of the imprisoned were no longer broken by imperial order, but rusted away in forgotten cells, or clattered to the floor in private chapels where forgiveness was whispered by candlelight. And the scrolls of clemency, once carried by royal messengers across the empire's muddy roads, faded into brittle fragments. The empire passed away, but the idea of mercy, faint, conditional, and enduring, remained. Not because it was enforced, but because it was remembered. Story 6: The Widow's Oath. Sworn testimonies in Germanic law. In the early medieval kingdoms that succeeded the Roman Empire across the Frankish, Bavarian, and Saxon lands, a different form of justice took root. It was not based on evidence in the modern sense, nor strictly on royal decree. Instead, truth itself was often determined by the spoken word, upheld by oaths, and shaped by the reputations of those who swore them. In this world, to swear falsely was not just a legal error, it was a moral collapse, a fracture of one's standing in the community. And among those who walked this delicate line between silence and speech was Jurhild, a widow in the Swabian highlands, whose name surfaces in a legal record from the year 891. Her story is not famous. It is not recounted in royal charters or noble chronicles, but in a parchment record from the monastery of Reichenau, her name is inscribed with a phrase, Duxit iuramentum defied sua, she took an oath on her truth. It was, at the time, a radical act, a weave of custom and code. By the end of the 9th century, much of Central Europe was governed by a blend of Germanic customary law and Carolingian legal overlays. Among the most influential codes were the Lex Salica, Salic law, Lex Alaminorum, and Lex Bejuvarium, each shaped by oral tradition before being committed to parchment by royal scribes. These laws were not applied equally. Nobles had higher compensation rates, wergilds, than commoners. Women were often under the protection of male kin or lords, and could rarely appear as legal initiators. But widows occupied a strange liminal space. They were women with legal identity no longer under a husband's hand, but often lacking powerful male advocates. And thus, when a widow made a claim or defense in court, she was often required to do so not by presenting material evidence, but by swearing an oath. The case of Jurhild. According to the record from Reichenau, Jurhild had accused a neighbor, Adalbert, of unlawfully seizing a parcel of land adjacent to her late husband's farmstead. The land, Jurhild claimed, had been given to her as a dotal gift, a form of marital property intended to support her in widowhood. Adalbert denied the claim, stating the land had reverted to the kin group after her husband's death. No written deed existed, and the property boundaries were vague, marked by low stone piles and trees long since felled. The court, consisting of local freemen, called for an oath of proof. If Jurhild could swear before God and community that the land was hers by right of gift, and if she could bring 3 oath helpers, reputable neighbors, who would swear to her integrity, the land would be restored. If not, the case would be closed in Adalbert's favor. For Jurhild, the stakes were high. Losing the land meant losing grazing rights, access to a well, and a buffer from encroaching debt. The ritual of the oath. On the morning of the oath-taking, the villagers gathered in the churchyard. This was no hidden trial, but a public ritual, meant to bind truth to community and consequence. Jurhild wore a simple wool tunic, a cross carved from cherry wood hanging at her neck. Her 3 oath helpers stood beside her, Helwid, an elder shepherd, Thietbold, a miller, and Frida, a weaver and fellow widow. Their role was not to affirm the specific facts of the land dispute, but to affirm Jurhild's character. In early Germanic law, the truth of a statement often depended more on the oathworthiness of the speaker than on any objective investigation. Jurhild raised her hand and swore, "May the Lord strike me down if I speak falsely. As I stand before God, I swear this land was given to me in truth and love by my husband, for my keeping, and for no other's hand to claim." Her helpers swore similarly, that she was honest, devout, and not known to lie under oath. The court accepted the oaths. The land was returned. And yet the victory was more than legal, it was social. For in a world where women's voices were often constrained, Jurhild had spoken with sacred authority and been believed. The weight of the spoken word. Sworn testimony was not casual. In these societies, where literacy was rare and writing expensive, speech had to carry legal and spiritual weight. A false oath could be punished not only with fines, but with excommunication, ostracism, or the loss of legal standing. In some regions, A person who was known to have sworn falsely could not serve on juries, bear witness in future trials, or even sell goods at market. For widows like Gerhild, the oath was a precious legal tool but also a risk. If a single oath helper had refused to stand beside her, the case would have collapsed. If one had been found later to have lied in another matter, her claim could be retroactively overturned. Oaths beyond the court. Oath-taking in the Germanic world extended beyond property disputes. Men swore peace oaths to end feuds between clans. Servants swore entry oaths when joining a household. Merchants swore trade oaths in unfamiliar markets. Even midwives and priests took oaths of service, some inscribed in prayer books still held in museums today. In all of these, the underlying idea was the same. Truth was not a neutral fact, but a bond, publicly sealed and witnessed. And for those without land, armies, or wealth, the oath was sometimes their only shield. What the laws don't say. The law codes of the era mention widows rarely and with caution. They are often defined in relation to what they lack: a husband, a male guardian, or economic protection. But when we read between the lines, in the margins of court records and monastery books, we find evidence of agency. A widow in Bavaria in 905, swearing an oath to reclaim stolen grain. A widow in Saxony in 875 accused of harboring fugitives, successfully cleared by her neighbor's sworn word. A widow in Alemannia negotiating land rights by invoking an oath made by her late husband decades prior. These stories are subtle. They are not the grand narratives of kings or bishops, but they are real, and they remind us that truth in this world was not found in parchment or scroll, but in a voice, a hand raised, and a community that listened. And so we ask, when truth is spoken, but its memory lives only in the ears of those who heard it, how long does it last? In the Germanic legal world, as the fragile layers of post-Roman Europe gave way to tribal kingdoms and regional duchies, one principle dominated all others in matters of law: honor. It was not written in gold, nor declared in royal proclamations. It was lived, spoken, whispered, and upheld by the ritual of the oath. This wasn't merely a legal mechanism. It was a sacred social contract, where the word of a person, especially one whose honor was unchallenged, carried the weight of truth itself. And when disputes arose, they were not resolved by cross-examination or evidence, but by compurgation, a communal oath-swearing that could lift or ruin lives. Compurgation, truth by consensus. Compurgation, also called oath-helping, involved a person accused of a crime, or making a claim, calling upon a group of individuals, usually 12 or more, who would swear an oath vouching for the truth of the statement or the general reliability of the claimant. These individuals, called oath helpers, sacramentals, or conjurators, did not need to witness the act in question. They simply had to swear that they believed the claimant or defendant to be honest and trustworthy. In practice, compurgation functioned as a social thermometer. The more reputable your connections, the stronger your case. The more tarnished your reputation, the fewer people would risk their own honor to support you. Failure to gather the required number of oath helpers was tantamount to confession. This meant that legal truth was fundamentally tied to reputation, especially important in communities where records were oral and memory was collective. The fragile edge of justice. For Gerhild, the widow from Reichenau, her successful land claim owed not only to her own speech, but to the willingness of others to stand beside her. Their oath, like hers, had spiritual and legal consequences. But what happened when oaths conflicted? In a case recorded in Fulda in the year 894, two parties, each claiming the same plot of land, presented equal numbers of oath helpers. Both swore their belief in the justice of their respective claims. Unable to resolve the case through compurgation, the court turned to ordeal. Trial by ordeal, when oaths failed. When oaths conflicted, or when a claimant lacked sufficient helpers, the case might be resolved through ordeal, physical trials meant to reveal divine judgment. Among the most common, ordeal by hot iron. The accused would carry a red-hot iron for a set number of paces. The wound would be bound and inspected days later. A clean healing was taken as innocence. Ordeal by cold water. The accused was submerged. If they sank, they were innocent. Floating suggested guilt interpreted as the water rejecting them. Ordeal by fire or boiling water, occasionally used for more severe cases. These ordeals were public, often accompanied by prayer, fasting, and blessings of the instruments by priests. The Church, though often uncomfortable with the practice, eventually formalized its role in supervising such trials. In the Fulda case, the ordeal was performed. The record does not state who passed, only that the land was assigned to one party and peace declared. But ordeal remained a brutal fallback, invoked only when social consensus failed. Women and oaths, between constraint and necessity. The legal systems of early medieval Europe were overwhelmingly patriarchal, and women's participation in law, especially public oath swearing, was restricted by custom, geography, and status. But widows occupied a unique legal category. In the Lex Salica, a widow could swear an oath in place of her late husband only if she had no adult sons or brothers-in-law to represent her. The matter involved personal property, dowry, or violation of her person or estate. This allowed women like Gerhild a narrow window to act autonomously, but only if their reputation was sound. Indeed, a woman known for gossip, disputes, or unseemly behavior could be disqualified from oath-taking. The community's moral judgment mattered more than the facts. A tale from Worms. In the city of Worms, a widow named Richeldes appeared before the court in 898, defending herself against accusations of harboring a runaway serf. She claimed she had merely offered the man bread and rest in Christian charity. Unable to produce a letter of protection or a noble patron, she relied on 4 neighbors, all women, who swore to her character and Christian kindness. The court accepted the oaths. The serf, however, was returned to his master, and Richeldes was warned not to interfere again. This case illustrates both the limits of a widow's authority and the delicate balance between justice, mercy, and control in early medieval society. The memory of the community. In a world without comprehensive records, memory functioned as the primary archive. The community remembered who had sworn falsely before, who had failed to fulfill prior oaths, who was known to be devout, charitable, violent, or deceitful. These memories influenced every future case. A woman like Gerhild might win her land claim once, but a whisper of dishonesty could ruin her prospects for future disputes. Even the dead were not immune. Oaths taken in their name could be challenged if later evidence emerged, or if a surviving witness offered conflicting testimony. Thus, law in the Germanic world was not a system of impersonal justice. It was a web of relationships, sustained by voices, eyes, and collective belief. A lingering question. Compurgation, though powerful, was fragile. It depended on human trust, and trust can falter. In the centuries to come, the practice would wane, replaced by documentary evidence, codified law, and eventually professionalized legal institutions. But in the late 9th century, the oath still reigned. And so we ask, what happens to truth when belief becomes scarce, when those who once stood beside you fall silent, not from disbelief, but from fear? As the 10th century dawned, the landscape of European justice began to shift. The weight of the spoken oath, once the axis upon which disputes turned, began to slowly yield to the power of parchment. In places like East Francia, Swabia, and Bavaria, where oath-swearing had long served as the bedrock of communal law, monastic scribes were increasingly tasked with writing down what had previously only been spoken aloud. This wasn't an overnight change, but rather a gradual, uneven transition that would redefine the practice of truth-telling. For women like Gerhild, and for the thousands of unrecorded widows, freemen, and laborers who once depended on voice and reputation, this shift marked both a loss of agency and a restructuring of power. From oral truth to written record, the legal codes that had been passed down orally like the Lex Salica or Lex Laminorum began to be copied and revised more regularly, with annotations and commentaries by clerics and royal officials. Courts increasingly began to require charters of land donation, witnessed property transfers, formalized testaments and wills. The sworn oath, while still respected, was gradually supplemented and eventually supplanted by documents, sealed and archived in monasteries, episcopal chanceries, or ducal courts. But this presented new challenges for those without access to scribes, literacy, or legal patrons. Gerhild's oath had once stood unchallenged, her voice backed by neighbors and faith. But in this new world, her claim would likely need to be written, preferably notarized, copied, and sealed. The spoken oath, once sacred and immediate, now risked being seen as insufficient, even suspect. Legal literacy and its gatekeepers. As documentation became standard, access to justice began to stratify. Those who could not read or write, or who lacked the means to pay a scribe, increasingly relied on clerical intermediaries. Monks acted as legal advisors, writing petitions, copying verdicts, and composing appeals. Bishops developed clerical courts, which often leaned heavily on written testimony. Royal courts required charters to be properly formatted and authenticated, or they would be dismissed. A widow like Gerhild, if she lived just a generation later, might find herself disbelieved, not because her oath was unworthy, but because it was unwritten. Oath-taking in decline. By the late 10th century, oath-taking had not vanished, but it had become increasingly ceremonial. In many courts, oaths were reserved for high-status disputes, confirming documentary evidence already submitted, swearing fealty or religious vows. The oath was now an adjunct to written proof, not a replacement for it. In some regions, this led to legal exclusion of the poor, the isolated, and the illiterate. Without documents or powerful witnesses, their claims were more easily dismissed. Even oath helpers became harder to find, not for lack of belief, but for fear of entanglement in legal complexities that demanded written backup. This shift was not universal. In the Danelaw regions of England, for example, oath swearing retained power longer. In parts of Scandinavia, the spoken word remained a legal tool well into the 11th century. But in the former Carolingian heartlands, the tide was clear. The last echoes of the widow's voice. A case from Bamberg, dated 982, describes an aging widow, Adelheid, attempting to defend her right to remain in her deceased husband's longhouse. She appeared in court alone, without documentation, and offered to swear an oath to her claim. The court refused, citing recent reforms that required written proof of inheritance. She was evicted. The record does not say where she went or who took her in. It simply notes, no proof presented, judgment rendered to heirs of Archibald. The law had changed. Her voice, once her protection, had been rendered silent by ink. What was lost, what was gained? The shift from oral to written justice brought many gains. Greater consistency in rulings. Clearer records for future disputes. The development of more abstract, objective legal standards. But it also came at a cost. The communal nature of oath-taking was replaced by bureaucratic detachment. The performative trust of public swearing was reduced to ink on parchment. And for many, justice became something one had to buy or negotiate through intermediaries. Women, the poor, and the isolated found their legal identities harder to assert. And though their names sometimes appear in records, it is usually as appendices, exceptions, petitions, or dismissed claims. Still, the legacy of the oath persisted in court ceremonies, in coronation rituals, in contracts where the seal might replace the voice, but the promise remained sacred. A final reflection. Gerhild, who once stood before her neighbors and claimed her right with her voice, belonged to a world where truth was lived and spoken. That world faded, but the memory of her oath, preserved in a brittle record, reminds us. Justice is not only a matter of law, it is a matter of who is heard. And so we ask, when truth moves from the mouth to the page, who holds the pen, and who is left voiceless?